I just feel sorry for the other breakouts.
Got two people.
Exactly.
I think this is so closely aligned with.
I'll maybe just wait for the last few to come in and then we'll make a start, conscious that we're running slightly behind and don't want to keep people from lunch. So
Yes.
great. I think we can make a start. Hi, thank you all very much for coming to our breakout session today. Really excited to be talking all things international AI policy alignment and collaboration. And we have an amazing lineup today. We have Dr. Keegan McBride, who is a lecturer in AI, Government and Policy at the University of Oxford, and is also an adjunct fellow in Technology and National Security at the Centre for a New American Security. We also have Susanna Odell, who joins us from Microsoft, and one of the headline sponsor of today, who works in government affairs, and before that was the Deputy Director in Digital at the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry.
Yeah.
That's right. And we also have my colleague and Clifford Chance's head of global tech policy, Philip Suta. Philip leads on all things public policy alongside our global tech team, which is a multidisciplinary team of over 600 lawyers across the world. And that's where I fit in. I'm one of our junior lawyers in the global tech team, advising on all things AI, cyber, privacy, alongside many other things. And yeah, really excited to be one of the breakout sponsor for today. So I think it's good to set the scene, but there has been a lot of scene setting already. And if any of you have attended the sessions this morning, I think this session is hopefully not going to be repetitive, but it's definitely going to hit on a lot of points that have kind of been signposted and references made earlier in the day. But why are we talking about international AI policy and why is it important? I think we can all agree that AI is here to stay and countries are racing now to come up with regulations and policies. But the approaches are fragmented and diverse, and we've seen that in the conversations this morning, that's posing challenges to global companies like Microsoft and many others, as well as for regulators to keep up with this. So I think today we're going to talk about the challenges around how to navigate this fragmented landscape, but also the opportunities that this brings for international alignment in AI policy and the work that's already being done by government, industry, multi-stakeholder organizations, talking about the successes, things that we can learn from. And kind of before we jump into the first question, just to set the scene slightly further, I'm sure you're all aware of the EU AI Act, which came into force in August this year as being the world's first comprehensive legal framework, taking a risk-based approach. Whereas in the UK, there's a more proactive, pro-innovation, principles-based approach, and we've just heard from the regulators on how they're addressing that through a sector-focused based approach. And then more widely in APAC, with the exception of China, which I think Keegan will speak to, there's been a lighter touch approach, more voluntary to AI regulation. Japan was referenced, Singapore was referenced this morning. I think quite interestingly, this is a very kind of topical conversation given the recent elections. Last year we had, in October 2023, we had the Biden administration executive order on the safe, secure and trustworthy development and use of AI. And that was kind of a landmark moment in US AI policy. And there's been gaining momentum in federal, state, and local laws. But it's kind of now, where does that all sit with Trump win? And this is a topic that I know Dr. Keegan is very passionate, and I think it's kind of something that I know our clients at Clifford Chance are really interested about as well, so I think Philip will also be able to speak to this. But Keegan, it'd be great to hear from you on what does a Trump win mean for international AI policy?
Thank you for the introduction, for sort of setting the foundations for this. I think probably, just going to be very blunt, that's all right. It's a really bad time to be in AI safety and AI ethics in the US. I would say. Probably okay for next month or two, but come January, it's going to be a different story. So maybe just to do some scene setting on how Trump and his sort of incoming administration are thinking about this, I think first and foremost, you have to keep in mind that the US is viewing AI from a perspective of competition with China. And there's actually quite a lot of bipartisan agreement on that. So during the first debate between Trump and Harris, they actually talked about AI and the important role that it had in this sort of emerging competition. Now, how we win this, or how we sort of make sure the US comes out on top, will differ depending on who you chat with. My understanding of what we might expect to see from the sort of incoming Trump administration is, first and foremost, the AI executive order that you mentioned is going to be repealed. This is actually the one thing that they talk about in the Republican platform. Can't quote it verbatim, but something to the effect of reclaiming control of AI, removing DEI, woke, et cetera, from sort of AI policy and AI regulation. And they'll consistently post to the sort of initial launch of Gemini of what it looks like when that goes wrong. So a lot on repealing that. There will be something baked and ready to go kind of when they take over in January, so I would expect a new executive order. Probably also worth just mentioning that in the first Trump presidency, there were actually two AI EOs as well, one in 2019, one in 2020, one on sort of trustworthy AI, and one on sort of modernizing the public sector with this technology. So I would expect to see kind of a continuation of that, and I think a lot of the folks who were involved in the first administration are still going to have a role to play now. So internal digitalization is something that Elon Musk is also quite big on, is going to be happening. There will be support for making sure that the world is using American AI, so I would see a lot more around sort of, empowering the American AI industry, unleashing energy, doing things like repealing sort of environmental protections, building up new energy grids, these sorts of things. AI Safety Institute, it's not clear what's going to happen there. Certainly it's not going to be as influential as it probably is at the moment, but we'll see what happens. The Andreessen Joe Rogan podcast actually is probably quite relevant if anybody's interested in this. It's a weird sentence to say. But I think a lot of these conversations around like the role that the government will play in the control of AI are actually quite relevant. So if in the current administration there was a lot of support for sort of these rules and regulations around ethics and transparency and bias, a lot of these are being viewed as sort of mechanisms for control of free speech, of the AI development, of the AI industry. And so I would see, this movement away from more centralized approaches like you have in Europe, and more towards the sort of like UK-based approach on sort of sector-specific, use case-oriented regulation.
Yeah, and I think, Anthony mentioned this morning Senator Ted Cruz's views that I think you wrote kind of a post on, which seems to have gone viral in the last 24 hours. So still very much an ongoing conversation. Perhaps, Philip, I don't know if would turn to you, your thoughts on this, because I know that this is something that we've written articles on within CC.
It's fascinating to hear your take, Dr. Keegan. As somebody who knows probably the UK and Europe best, and looking into the United States and following it closely, it's interesting to wonder how much of a difference there is between the messaging and the substance. The messaging is obviously hugely different. So, Trump said he talked about a dangerous executive order, radical left-wing ideas, and that Republicans support AI developments rooted in free speech and human flourishing. And his second EO, 13960, promoted public trust and confidence while protecting privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, and American values. I mean, the Trump EO talks about privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties, and I suppose you can either take that as lip service, or you can think, well, that's an important thing to include. I wonder, I think one can be pessimistic about the things that you said are worthy of pessimism, but I also wonder how much radical substantial difference there will be, given the fact that there are people incoming to the administration who have thought about AI safety. I'm thinking in particular of Elon Musk, who has spoken about AI safety and in particular X risk, and you can sort of take that or leave it, and you can wonder how committed he is now given X AI, but I'm not sure whether it's totally clear whether radical pessimism is justified. I think we'll have to wait and see.
Interesting. Keegan, Susanna, do you want to kind of chip in on this?
Can,
Or Keegan?
no, I can respond, but I'll let you go first.
I mean, I can keep my remarks short. And firstly, just to say thank you so much to Clifford Chance and to techUK for putting on this session particularly. I think it's really timely. I've got the slightly unique challenge of not saying everything that my colleagues in the plenary said earlier, so I'll try and keep my remarks not kind of exactly verbatim to what they said. But I think, you know, from our company perspective, you know, we look forward to working with, or continuing to work with the US government and governments around the world on this. And I think from a US perspective particularly, it's been encouraging to see the kind of focus on innovation still as a mechanism for economic growth and public service delivery. So that's positive. But I think more broadly, and I know this is something that we're going to go on to talk about in the panel in a minute, is that there still needs to be this kind of focus on international AI alignment and interoperability. And I think actually, Philip, to your point, particularly around that kind of shared understanding of risk and mitigation. Otherwise, if we don't have that, then we're not going to be able to kind of reap the benefits of the technology that's there. So really kind of looking forward to that discussion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we'll come back to that in a second. Perhaps we'll just give Keegan an opportunity to come back on. I think we could have a whole session just discussing kind of the presidential election. So we will try to move on. But Keegan, if you have any last words on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll try to connect it to the sort of broader international stuff as well. What I would say is it's probably a good time to be in the tech industry in the US, and I think if you talk with folks in DC, there's actually pretty good bipartisan understanding that under the first Trump administration was okay for the tech industry. And I think we're going to see similar things, like in terms of innovation, in terms of being able to get things done, that will be happening. It's not clear who will win out. So you mentioned Musk and his sort of attachment to AI safety stuff. There's a big sort of debate at the moment on which side is sort of going to come out on top. It's not clear. There are different factions within the Republican Party who are trying to sort of orient themselves to sort of dictate the direction that the stuff goes in. So actually, Politico has done quite a lot of coverage on AI policy under the Biden administration, looking at how, for example, RAND was quite influential in scoping what the AI EO looked like there, particularly around sort of national security risks, existential risk, stuff like that. The same folks are trying to get in at the moment, but there's also a substantial resistance from the Republican Party side that wasn't there to the same extent on the Democratic side. Now, what this all means, I think, and what's important to understand is that, and relating to the Cruz letter as well, is that the US really wants to sort of make it clear that it is in charge of its own destiny when it comes to technology and regulation. So when it is going to engage with these topics of regulation in the international community, it's always going to be from this perspective of how do we ensure that the US comes out on top. So you can look at previous attempts. You mentioned the earlier AI executive order. But if we think about international things such as GPAI, this was spearheaded by Michael Kratsios when he was at CTO under the Trump administration to specifically exclude China from international cooperation. So this is a dimension that's not going to go away, and I would expect more of that to continue. So we can talk about international cooperation on regulation and interoperability and alignment, but that is happening specifically to make sure that the US has a growth in power and influence in the broader global ecosystem and to sort of resist China's rise in this space as well.
And I think we will come back to talk more about the kind of US-China competition maybe later in the conversation. But just moving on to going back to what Susanna referenced, today we've heard references to the Bletchley AI Safety Summit in November 2023, Seoul in May this year, and going back before that, the G7 Hiroshima AI Summit in last year, all being great examples of international collaborations in AI policy, and Microsoft obviously being one of the 16 companies that signed up to commitments under in Seoul this year. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you, Susanna, to start off with, like, how successful we think these collaborations have actually been, and maybe some lessons that we can learn going into next year. We know there's going to be the Paris AI Action Summit in February.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Stella. And gosh, where to start? Because you've already outlined 3 or 4, and there are plenty of examples of where we've had really productive international conversations. I think maybe to kind of take it a step back, earlier this year, Microsoft did a piece of research really, and then published a book in May looking at where we can look at kind of historical analogies of international collaborations on technology, looking at the likes of CERN, the IPCC, and civil aviation, and thinking, okay, well, what did those do? Were they successful? What lessons can we learn from those? And we spoke to academics, we spoke to researchers, and we also spoke to people who were involved in creating and furthering the objectives of those organizations and those groupings. And I think what we learned is that there's no easy kind of drag and drop internationally for AI, but there are kind of 3 broad global governance outcomes that come from that you can see in some of those other collaborations that we think operate at a uniquely international level that we can then use to think about how we govern AI globally. So the 3 are globally significant risk management, regulatory interoperability, and then inclusive progress. And then I think what you can do is you can map what we've seen internationally onto a lot of those. So for example, if you take the globally significant risk and how we look at that internationally, that's where you've seen the development of AI safety institutes around the world, and increasingly the kind of network approach there, and had some colleagues who were in San Francisco recently thinking about how those networks can kind of how those institutes can productively work together, and I think there's been a lot of progress there. Then on regulatory interoperability, that's where, Ella, as you mentioned, the G7 work and the Hiroshima AI process and code of conduct. And again, thinking about how that then points towards a kind of a broad North Star. It's essentially a playbook for AI developers on kind of international governance, and thinking about how that can then be a North Star when domestic regimes are thinking, okay, well, how do we regulate AI? So again, you have that, you're starting to see that layer operate there. And then you've got the inclusive progress aspect, and I think, again, we've seen a lot of movement there. We've seen UN General Assembly resolutions from the US and from China. We've seen kind of private partnerships looking at how to support both the diffusion of AI, but also the development of AI. So, for example, Microsoft partnered with an organization or company called G42 earlier this year, all about how we can support the development of the AI infrastructure that's required in place across the global south, skills development, really thinking about how we can bring in perspectives from the global south into all of the international kind of fora and collaborations. So I think there's been a lot that we've seen, and I think those buckets can be a kind of helpful mechanism to think about how we're looking at where kind of uniquely international fora can be helpful. On the lessons learned, I've got views on this as well, but I think overall there's still a long way to go. There's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of the shared understanding of risks, even having an agreed upon list of AI risks that countries say, yep, these are the ones that we're going to prioritize, and this is how we are thinking about mitigating that risk in a way that's not just kind of domestically focused, but we have that kind of shared understanding. There's a lot of scientific work and research that still needs to happen there. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And it's great to hear kind of from industry, like a tech organization, to hear from your perspective, kind of in practice, how that is being operationalized, which seems to be the key word of the day. And another international collaboration, which I thought was interesting, was in September this year, there was the world's first legally binding treaty, which was signed by a number of countries. So perhaps, Philip, I could turn to you to see whether you think that kind of, I mean, maybe it's too soon to tell, but in practice, do we think this is going to be kind of, how's it going to work?
I think at an international level, in terms of hard laws and commitments, it's incredibly difficult to make progress. If you look at the COP process in the environmental space, that is an international process that has as its objective binding targets, tremendous amount of time and money, political capital has been invested in it, and it's only just, I mean, queries it working, that's a separate question, but it's just about managed to even say on its own terms that it's got some objectives. Whether they're going to be met or not is a different question. There's nothing like that in the AI space. International lawyers, the exciting people that they are, often joke that there's no such thing as international law because it hasn't been invented yet. I think, and we'll be moving on to this in the sort of the later discussion, that treaty is, I think it serves more of a purpose of awareness raising, connecting geopolitical actors, defining the terms of the debate. I don't think anything is going to, I think it's unlikely that anything will happen under those treaties, that they'll be enforced in any meaningful way. They are part of our attempt and our process to frankly get our heads around this. Mm-hmm. But on those terms, I think they're useful and important and they serve a purpose. Sorry if that's a bit wishy-washy.
No, I think that's a fair answer. And kind of just linking back to something that Susanna said around those three kind of key themes, principles, inclusive progress being the third one, kind of jumping around here, but I think inclusivity and access is something that's been brought up in the earlier conversations today. There was mention around AI models being English-centric and kind of talking about it's going to be a race to access to resources and computing, particularly in developing nations. So perhaps we can talk about ways in which AI policy alignment can help reduce the digital divide between developed and developing nations. And I think hopefully you all have perspectives on this, but perhaps we could start, Keegan.
Yeah. So I think one thing that you're seeing, and sorry for always sort of framing this in US-China perspectives, but I think it's really hard to talk about it without doing that, is that China is basically perceived as having sort of more interest in Africa, Southeast Asia. Their models are increasingly open source. They're working with sort of minority languages. They're not only making their applications available to these sorts of communities, but they're also going out and helping to build infrastructure, to provide compute, things like that. The US, and to be honest, the West thus far has actually been really slow to respond to this. And there are also some historical reasons that they're perhaps not the most liked countries in that region as well. That is starting to freak people out. So I would expect to see more movement from the US into these regions. I expect them to do more on trying to get them using American infrastructure, about building up sort of international understandings and regulations around ethics and these sorts of things. But it will be primarily driven from this sort of competition type angle I'm not sure where we'll end up, but certainly that's what's going on at the moment. And there is efforts to, for example, get USAID, FCDO, stuff like that involved to try to export whatever UK or American AI abroad, but there are some regulatory restrictions on how this can be done, what they can do that are actually inhibiting a lot of this at the moment. But I would expect to see some sort of regulatory innovation happening in that space in the near future.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. And I think it's always important to talk about the kind of big players, the US, China. I know that there's been a big focus on techUK, the UK, EU, but it's interesting to also think about what's going in other parts of the world. I don't know, Susanna, Philip, whether you've got any views on this or anything to add.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think it's exactly the right question to be asking. And it really goes back to a point that one of my colleagues made this morning around AI diffusion. So AI is not a single purpose technology like a lawnmower where you use it for one thing and probably don't use it for other things, or don't know about people in this audience. But AI is a general purpose technology. And so that means that it has many different uses, is going to be able to transform lots of different sectors, create new markets. But unlike electricity, which is another general purpose technology that was invented, 150 plus years ago, and 700 million people still don't have access to it today, we can't let the same happen for AI. And so it's really important at these early stages, talking about domestic regulation, but also that kind of global governance approach, that we're thinking about, why we need to do that. We need to do that to support public trust, which helps businesses, which helps consumers feel like they are kind of more comfortable using the technology, and also engenders trust between different countries themselves. So I think, that global governance process is incredibly important. And then thinking about, how to bring in voices across the globe. So, for example, I talked a bit about the G7 process, which was the Hiroshima AI process, which again was developed under the Italian presidency of the G7, and now is working with the OECD on a reporting framework for what those kind of principles could look like in practice. There's now a much larger kind of friends group who are engaging in that process as well. So countries in Latin America, across the world. And so I think it's making sure that those kind of international fora are bringing in lots of voices in different ways. One of the things that we've done at Microsoft is work with the Stimson Center to create a kind of fellowship on global governance and global perspectives on AI. So that's working with people around the world on their perspectives on what the AI applications could be that are most helpful for them, where they see the risks, and then making sure that that's all fed back up into these international discussions. So I think there are lots of different ways to do it, but ultimately the reason to do it is because this is a general purpose technology that is going to bring potentially huge benefits all around the world, and different benefits in different jurisdictions depending on their economic makeup, the sectors that really drive their economy, and their own priorities. But I think kind of going back to why it's important, and the fact that public trust kind of sits beneath that is really important.
No, I think, you've touched on some key themes there. It's the importance of energy underlying all of this, and it's great that we had representation from Ofgem earlier to be involved in the conversation. And again, public trust, which is something that's come up a lot this morning. Andrew Pax MP kind of really emphasising that without that, this could go horribly wrong. And talking of things going wrong, I think perhaps I could turn to you, Philip, to ask, if we don't have international alignment on AI policy, kind of what could happen, what would the bad consequences be?
I mean, that's such an imponderable, isn't it? It's such a big question, and it really makes me want to sort of take a step back. My undergraduate degree was philosophy, and I never thought it would be useful in the real world, and I'm shocked that it's come in useful in my role. One of the things I studied was scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts and things like future shock, Alvin Toffler's concept in the 1970s, where profound developments cause huge disruption and dislocation in societies. And I often wonder what it must have felt like in the 1940s and 50s with the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer, that brilliant film that I'm sure many of you have seen, that sort of seems to channel the atmosphere and the fear and the opportunity. And I think what we feel now about this is probably a bit what it felt like then. And what developed in that space, in nuclear energy, and nuclear, was because it's dual use. It's both something that creates a huge amount of energy and is a positive thing, but also has tremendous downsides if it's weaponized. And people were struggling with similar questions sort of then. We had Bretton Woods, so we had a broad framework for international structures, and people were thinking about global cooperation, state, country level regulation, ethical reflections, and structures started to be put in place. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing now, but we're at very early stages. And assuming things don't go horribly wrong, assuming things go reasonably well, which is a sort of a base case, I think, for a lot of us, in 10, 20 years, 30 years, we'll probably see what we see today in the nuclear space, in the AI space. And people have, talked about, international summits and international treaties and said, well, they didn't really achieve very much. But again, it's what's our process as humanity to get our heads around this as a complex system? And summits and talking shops serve a purpose. The AISIs, the AI Safety Institutes, sort of emerged somewhat from those summits, and they have a hard, granular value in terms of creating capabilities that can start to interrogate the way that the black boxes of generative pre-trained transformers, GPTs, work. And it's creating capabilities to help see what is happening when the transformer is firing, which is the equivalent of our neurons and our general purpose network firing. That's useful. Bletchley was the first time in a public forum where there was a Chinese minister with a science and tech portfolio talking publicly with a US minister and other so-called Western ministers. That has value, I think. So what will happen if we get it wrong? I mean, yeah, you can sort of imagine what would happen, but it seems to me that at least the very bare minimum is happening to get our heads around this.
Yeah, no, and I think we can always learn from looking back on history, previous kind of technological advancements, and even the mention of the printing press this morning and the learnings around that. I think it's always helpful to look back. And I mean, I think that was a rather optimistic take, but I feel like, Keegan, you're maybe less optimistic. Would I be right in making that assumption?
Well, I mean, I think it's okay to be sort of utopian and think about all the great things we wish would happen when it comes to global AI governance, but it's also important to be a little bit pragmatic. Not saying that you're not, just objectively, we live in a different world. I don't see any space where we have international agreement in the near future. If you look at the sort of, reality, I mean, the US has most of the AI infrastructure, most of the AI companies, capital, critical technology, intellectual property. They're flexing their sort of muscle to make sure that their adversaries aren't able to access this. So if you do see something here, and I think there is stuff going on, but it's more from like a broader control perspective. So I think China is sort of preparing for, the eventual downfall of sort of current liberal aligned world order, so to say, and there's quite a lot of sort of thinking going on in that space. And you can see this playing out already in sort of internet governance, some of the conversations that are happening there, where they're cooperating with states like Russia and Iran to sort of align a lot of the emerging norms with their sort of worldview, which is not necessarily the same as it is in the US. There's also war on the planet at the moment. Tensions are high, conflict is growing. So while it would be very nice to go and shake hands and say we're going to work together on this and everything's going to be great, neither side trusts each other. Both sides are engaged in whatever cyber operations. Microsoft has played a huge role, I think, and been on the receiving end of quite a lot of things, from solar winds to other sort of supply chain related incidents. It's not a world of peace at the moment. There's tons of stuff happening. And so the last thing that either the US or China or other states want to do is sort of make themselves weaker by saying, yes, we agree to not do this. And I think this is unfortunately the world that we live in. And when you start to think about it from this perspective, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why the US and other states might be thinking about these things in the way that they are. I think just yesterday or the day before, for example, the head of GCHQ, I believe, was doing an interview about how the UK's digital infrastructure is sort of under threat from sort of intrusions from Russia and China and so on. So like that's the world we live in. And then when you take that framing, you can start to have more pragmatic conversations around like AI and regulation and governance. I think you are seeing a lot of constructive things happening in this space. There is some stuff going on when it comes to sort of more critical national security risks. Yes, it makes sense for the government to be thinking about these things. But anyway.
Conscious that we're meant to have lunch and there's also meant to be time for Q&A, so don't want to drag things on, but just kind of a landing point, Susanna touched on public trust, and someone in one of the previous sessions suggested that the solution to that was open source. But kind of, I guess it would be nice just to have like a one-word sentence on where we think international, these are big questions, by the way, but it's hard to summarize, but just like a kind of, if there's one thing that the audience could take away today on where things are headed or kind of things we should be thinking about for next year, it'd be great just to kind of have a quick one sentence from each of you, if that's possible.
You want to go first?
I think 2025 is going to be a big year.
The two things I would focus on are looking at what happens with the OECD reporting framework on the G7, because if that lands, it will be kind of a world first and bringing in kind of both industry and government perspectives on that. And the second one is what happens with the network of ACs and all of the kind of scientific research that's still required and the kind of shared understanding of risk. I think that'll be really important.
I think just pay attention to the ecosystem and the diffusion of this stuff. Big AI model does not necessarily mean that it's more important than better processes and better infrastructure and better sort of ability to roll things out quickly. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we'll have 5 minutes for questions. And just before I go out to the audience, just a kind of reminder, if we can try and keep the questions focused on what we've discussed today, international AI policy, that'd be great. I see you had your hand up.
Yeah, Janine.
Oh, sorry, I think there's a microphone.
Janine McKelvey from BT Group. I'm the GC for Data, AI and Security. Some comments quickly. I think, Philip, your thinking around the jury still being out, I would agree with that on Trump. If you just look at what happened with TikTok, and he's flip-flopped all over the place there, and his own staffers and cabinet are not in agreement with how to deal with that. I think if you speak to someone like Jules Belensky, who heads up Future of Privacy Forum, he says, ironically, you might actually see the first federal privacy law across the US, because in an attempt to kick out all the Californian privacy red tape, the Republicans have started to put forward things like, let's copy the Texas privacy legislation and make that a federal legislation because it's a much easier, watered-down version. And then the other point I wanted to make was around the reality of actually doing business. The US may chuck out AI laws, but the truth is, if you're going to sell products, if you want to sell your US products into Europe, you're going to have to comply with European laws. And that's actually where I think we're going to see some tension, because it'll be a trade tension issue. And what's going to be difficult for the US is when you have people like Elon Musk sitting in government. Would Trump actually say, be influenced by US business and it's those stakeholders? So just a few thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. And as somebody that's working with clients every day, compliance with the EU AI Act is very much everybody's kind of top priority with obligations coming into force as early as February next year. So yeah, really great points. I don't know who else. I think you had your hand up, and then there's one at the back and one over here, and then I think that's probably time for lunch.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was how are we going to be able to maintain some kind of balance, or how do we shift towards a balance of collaboration over just pure competition, and how do we hold countries or states accountable for that?
Susanna, Philip, well, I mean, I welcome anybody to answer this one.
Yeah, my mic's on. I thought I was going to grab the microphone. I think it's a good question. I think it's important, right? And actually, if we think back to one of the earlier questions around kind of what happens if we get kind of fragmented regulation and kind of AI policy across the world, who loses out is businesses. Businesses that could be located in any country, but ultimately, particularly for smaller businesses, having to navigate a really complex and kind of fragmented regulatory regime is burdensome, is expensive, has an impact on their growth and their ability to scale. So I think that's a really interesting perspective, an important perspective to take, because ultimately, any country will want their businesses to succeed. So thinking about actually what the benefit is, there is an economic benefit for every country to be thinking about that kind of globally interoperable system.
I mean, the question about, there are 2 points I'd like to make. I think the collaboration versus competition and how do you make states accountable thing that's such a big question that I'm not even going to try and answer it, except I think there's something around fairness and sort of rule of law there. Federal privacy law, that would be on my bingo card. I think it's unlikely, but I would put it on my bingo card, for the reasons that you posited. In terms of EU, it's really interesting. The EU AI Act is almost a brute force type scenario. You've got to comply with it, whether you like it or not. If you want to sell into the EU market, you've got to comply with it. The devil's in the detail. There is uncertainty around how the guidance is going to be applied. We're already seeing some companies saying we're not going to roll out our latest capabilities in the EU because of uncertainty. Now, you can say, well, that's political posturing, or you can take that as a signal from the market about concern for the level of lack of clarity, if I can put it like that, in the guidance. The GDPR, people talk about the Brussels effect and GDPR, and how GDPR basically was cut and pasted by a lot of people. I really don't think that's going to happen with the EU AI Act, but it is nonetheless going to have a huge impact on how companies deploy, develop, comply in the AI space.
Definitely, and I think we'll have to wait and see. I think quite a lot of countries do seem to be taking the kind of sit back, wait and see what happens with how the AI Act's obligations are actually being kind of the guidance that's being put out. So it'll be really interesting to see next year. I think we had one question. It's been answered, hopefully. And one final question here, and then I think we'll go for lunch.
Gosh, my question is keeping everyone from lunch.
Better be good.
I'm going to talk really slowly. So my question is about the pace of change. So the current state of AI is actually just still very early days, and the pace of change is very fast. I think we'll see some very challenging things emerging in the coming months. And we talked about previous things like the printing press, which played out over 250 years, the Industrial Revolution played out over 150 years, even the nuclear thing played out over 100 years. These things play out over months, not even years now. So in one legislative cycle, you'll get 3 or 4 turnarounds of technology. So how do governments keep up with that? How do you stop it sort of just kind of washing over you because it's changing so fast? Especially when the things that it's producing are creating real opportunities for governments, opportunities in the criminal justice system, in immigration, and in warfare and things like that. So things they want to take advantage of, while at the same time trying to keep control of this beast, which seems to be just rolling forward like a juggernaut.
I've got a very super quick answer on that, which is two parts. The first one is, I think, thinking about it in terms of regulation at different levels of the stack. And so at application level, you've already got regulators for kind of sector-specific areas that can do a lot of the work there. And then you've got the kind of large language model layer, or model layer, and again, focusing on the highly capable models there is helpful. And then you've kind of got the infrastructure layer. But I think one thing that's been really helpful and interesting about some of the international conversations on AI recently is that actually we haven't really had an instance before where really we were starting from so much of a blank slate internationally. And so I think that, combined with a lot of political will from different countries, combined with the fact that a lot of the commitments are kind of voluntary and building, has created this really kind of adaptable and agile regime that I think kind of sets us up quite well to go forward, as long as we then continue to think, right, what is an outcomes-based process? How can we think about, what we want the end result to be, and then not focus on really, really specific, for example, techniques that might need to adapt in another 6 months or a year. So it's outcomes-based and thinking about it across the stack.
If I could just really quickly as well, I mean, I think it's not true to say that this came from nowhere. You can go back to like 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. There's been tons of development on machine learning, statistics, AI, going back decades. Even 6-7 years ago, I wrote a report with the OECD on the use of AI in the public sector. All of that's pretty much relevant today, but we were in that doing a case study on ChatGPT 2.0, and they didn't want to release it because they were scared it was going to end the world. We've come now multiple iterations since then. We're still here. There are governments that have been using AI or machine learning for decades. I think what happened is that many governments are just waking up to the fact that digital technologies are important. And so the EU has put, I think, 190 billion euro as part of the COVID-19 relief budget into digital innovation. You have huge investments being made across the European Union and the world into new digital infrastructure. AI will be a part of this, and this is where the sort of collaboration, cooperation, competition stuff comes into play, is that as governments around the world are building all of this infrastructure, who is going to sort of play a leading role there? And this is why Meta, for example, is sort of betting on open source AI, because they see that as being a much bigger a better bet, I guess, than the closed source approach. And I think they're probably right. And you are starting to see some success with countries rolling out open source AI-based solutions into their government infrastructure. And so I think we'll start seeing much more of that. But also, I'm not worried about this sort of spiraling out of control, to be honest. I think some people assume that this is going to keep scaling forever and ever, and we'll see. But yeah, on the government side, they have been doing this for a while. I think lots of people are just waking up, realizing that they can do it too.
Philip, any final remarks? Or I did actually have one thing to say to that, is that I think that conversations like this today, and bringing people together from all different, from government, academia, tech firms, but also having engineers, some of the things that were said earlier today about having the people that are actually developing these new use cases in the room with regulators, with the people that are coming up with the guidance, like that's really important to be able to kind of keep up, or at least be chasing with the advancements. I suppose, lunchtime, but thank you all so much for coming, and hope you've enjoyed today.